So we're in the 21st century, so I better talk about 21st century entrepreneurship. So a little bit about myself. I don't want to talk too much about it. Hanno said most of it. For first third of my professional experience, I tried to disrupt the world of industrial automation with PC technology, which was groundbreaking back then. I joined a startup, IRIDAS. They are in near Stuttgart, and they are to this day quite an innovative company. Then I decided I wanted to do something else. I made technology for Hollywood. So back when I started, everything was projected on film and everything was shot on film, and you could already see that things would go digital at some point. So we helped drive that, and after a little bit more than 10 years, I was able to sell it to Adobe. And I stayed on at Adobe for a little while, started 2 other companies while I was there. First company, CoGlobo, is a venture capital and research company. And then I started a foundation, the Kayser Forum for Sustainability, which does environmental research and education. So I stayed on at Adobe for about 3 years, and after that, last year I decided I will focus on only my stuff. I'm an entrepreneur at heart. It's interesting to manage in a big organization. In the end, that's not what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. So here I am again, doing stuff that I have no idea about, and I will talk a little bit about the things that I think are important today. So what keeps me up at night? This keeps me up at night. So some of you have seen this graph. This is the temperatures rising over the last century, basically, due to climate change. I mention that because it seems like when we talk about entrepreneurship, we always talk about entrepreneurship, and then when we talk about climate change, we talk about the environment, and these are kind of separate things, and we can't bring them together. Well, climate change is a big problem, right? And these were the numbers from last year, and 2015, and some of you have noticed it, is already again the hottest year on record. So far, politics has not been able to solve that problem at all, and we all know that there are quite dramatic consequences if we don't do anything about it. So whenever I go to business conferences, we talk about all this cool stuff that we are developing as entrepreneurs. And don't get me wrong, I'm really excited about all this stuff. I use Uber all of the time. In the United States, I'm not an Apple Watch guy, but maybe I will be at some point. I think the Oculus Rift is a great thing, that will allow us to experience things in different ways. But let's face it, if we don't solve the other stuff, then quite frankly, the rest is quite meaningless, right? So how is it? How can it be that when I am at a business conference, I can spend 2 entire days without the word climate change or any meaningful discussions about what we could do about it? And whenever I mention it, people say, "Oh yeah, it's very, very important. I'm so scared about it." And then they say, "And by the way, the new marketing trends about apps is really important, right?" So it's like we kind of just put it to the side and try to focus on something else. But I would challenge you to see that this is actually the same thing, right? So let's talk about the challenges, right? So a couple of months ago, I was in Africa for the first time. I went to Ethiopia. I will tell you a little bit why I went there later on. And this is how it looks there, right? And so what do you see here? So if I look at this, first thing is, obviously this is a slum, or it's maybe a slum. Sometimes you think it's a slum, but it's actually a middle-class neighborhood. So you have to recalibrate your senses sometimes a little bit. And then you see, of course, a poor guy, who doesn't have a car. Well, if we think as entrepreneurs, we see opportunities, right? I see a lot of roofs that could host solar panels. And obviously, there's some idea about improving transportation there. So I'm not the only guy, so DHL actually already figured that out. But yeah, let's talk about some of the opportunities that lie in these countries, right? So, we've seen, some of you have heard the word leapfrogging, right? Sometimes these developing countries actually can leapfrog the developed countries because they don't have an investment in existing infrastructure. This has happened with mobile versus landlines. Almost everybody in Africa owns a mobile phone now, even if they are relatively poor. Why? Because it's one of the main ways of paying somebody, right? I mean, look at Apple Pay, it's not even here yet. In Africa, a lot of people pay via mobile phones. So they have actually leapfrogged us there compared to where we are today here. Other things, I will just throw some things here. Mesh networks versus centralized cell phone towers, where the devices actually communicate with each other. Interesting technology. Could be something where, again, developing countries leapfrog the West because it's easier to deploy something like that if you don't have an existing infrastructure with LTE hotspots everywhere. Decentralized energy. It's a big topic actually in Europe now, especially after Elon Musk's announcement about the very cheap batteries that allow you to store renewable energy. So obviously, if you don't have a grid, you don't have to argue with your utilities, whether it's better to do decentralized versus centralized. Well, you put up a solar cell, you put up a battery, and there is your microgrid that can actually power your village. So there's a lot of stuff where the lack of existing infrastructure can actually help you get new ideas. And then, of course, the terrible debate about renewables versus fossil fuels. Ethiopia is actually a country that has decided to go entirely renewable. So they will not invest in any non-renewable energy sources like nuclear or coal, which is extremely interesting because of the debate that we have here in Germany, where obviously the utilities and all the providers have a big investment in all the traditional power generations methods and are very reluctant to actually move to the renewable side. I put that up here because obviously public transportation versus individual transportation, bicycles versus cars is a big topic, right? So if you don't have a lot of cars yet, it's maybe easier to go to a public transportation infrastructure than it is if you have a city like LA, for example, that is just full of highways. So there's a lot of stuff, right? There are a lot of opportunities for private investment in these countries. So what does that have to do with you guys, right? I'm under no illusions that you will probably not all go to Africa and build stuff, even though if you want to, I think that's extremely interesting. So this all sounds very, very far away from us, right? We live in this beautiful city. It's highly modern, very, very rich. But it's very easy to forget that a generation ago, Bavaria actually was a farm state that got lots of subsidies from all the other states in Germany. All this high-tech stuff that we see today is relatively new. So if you look at if you look at a country like Ethiopia today, it's easy to say, oh yeah, this is so far behind, I'm not interested in it. Things can actually change quite quickly. So a couple of weeks ago, I visited my home, the house that I grew up in, 35 years ago, for the first time in 35 years. And at first, it actually looks very similar. This is the home. The funny thing is, I had this big house in my head, when I thought about it, and then when I went there, it's like, wow, this is tiny. I also thought we had like this huge garden, and then it was like basically, this. Well, I guess I was slightly smaller back then, so the relative size was bigger. So at first glance, it looks very, very similar. We didn't have running water in the toilet, for example, all of this stuff. It didn't look that different. But on second glance, it's actually totally different, right? So there used to be a silo tower here. There's now a cell phone tower, excellent LTE reception, in a very rural spot. And the farm is completely covered in solar cells, which is quite usual nowadays. If you travel all over Bavaria, you see farms all covered in solar cells. But of course, this is a very recent development. And I talked to the farmer, and he said, by renting out his farmland for the cell phone tower and generating energy from the roof of his farm, he gets more money than actually by, selling the goods that he plants on his farm, which is also interesting, just coming back to entrepreneurship. So why was I in Ethiopia? So this is my friend Ben Goertzel. He's one of the leading artificial intelligence researchers in the world. And he told me that he has an artificial intelligence lab in Addis Ababa. I said, you have a what in Addis Ababa? I thought they were the people, with the rice in their hands and stuff like that. I had no idea what was going on. He said, no, there's extremely well-educated people there. They speak excellent English. The internet connection is fine. Why would I not put them into Addis Ababa? And if it's a little bit hard to see, but here Ben is presenting one of his robots in the streets of Addis, and we caused quite a commotion there, obviously. So when I visited Ben, I also met Ebru, who is arguing with Ben here in this picture about how much he should be giving back to Ethiopia by employing people there. And Ebru is a fascinating woman. Ebru builds drones in Ethiopia. She's originally Turkish. And if I say drones, I mean, you're thinking drones, but Ebru is building drones, right? So they have drones with 20-meter wingspan that secure the borders of Ethiopia, which is quite a big deal, in Ethiopia. So yeah, think about it, right? Here's two people who are doing extremely innovative work. Ebru is basically laminating carbon fiber composites in Ethiopia. And when you had asked me, about Ethiopia half a year ago, I would have said, yeah, well, whatever. They're probably subsistence farmers, and that's it, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on that we don't usually notice. So again, what does that mean for us? So for me, it meant, my companies were always international, right? I always found people wherever I found the best people. So I never cared, whether they were, in the Czech Republic or in Slovakia or in Canada or in Brazil or whatever. I just hired them wherever I found them. And I got the best people in the world working for me by following this principle. So here's a couple of my companies, right? This is my old company, again, Munich, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Canada, LA, and later also Argentina. This is another company that I founded. It does multilingual social media. So in other words, right now the internet is fragmented, especially social media. So the Spanish people are talking to the Spanish people, English people are talking to the English people. And how do you actually communicate across the language barrier? You don't, right? Well, that's what the company does. It translates the stuff back and forth. I just started a team for my next company, which is dealing with 3D printing, advanced manufacturing. And I started it in Addis in cooperation with Ben. So I have my first team members in Addis now. And very well educated Master of Science and Technology. Amazing, right? And the only thing that I notice when about the fact that she's in Addis, the first employee, is that her profile picture doesn't look like a typical German woman. So, if you think about your next big thing, think about international work, right? Don't think you have to build it all in Germany. Don't think it has to be in Silicon Valley or in Berlin because it's so hip. You have to just look at the world and see where you get the best people. And obviously, there's also a cost advantage to having people in developing countries. And the other thing is, I've never seen people who are as driven as people from that area, right? I met a guy who literally walked 500 kilometers from his hometown to study at the University of Adama near Addis. And he's working on an exoskeleton right now. And basically his primary education before he started studying was reading used books during the day, because at night he didn't have light. So a couple of things that I think will change in the next couple of years. So I talked about energy a little bit before. So one of the interesting things about renewable energy is that it doesn't consume fuel. So if we talk about the cost parity between renewables and fossil fuels, it's a bit of a misnomer. Because right now the cost of fossil fuel is the maintaining cost. So I have to mine fuel, I have to transport fuel, I have to burn the fuel, have to dispose of the fuel. On the renewable side, it's building solar cells, it's building wind power plants, etc. So it's investment costs. So it's not running costs, it's investment costs. Now imagine what will happen once all the investment is done. It's free energy, right? Because, I mean, what do you have to do with a solar cell once it's built? You know, sometimes you have to clean it with a wet cloth, I think. And that's it. You know, it will probably last 100 years. They will guarantee you that it will last for 25 years already. So the cost for solar energy will drop to zero, essentially, right? Compare that with coal and nuclear and all of these other sources which are non-renewable. And the main cost is actually mining and transportation and disposal. So I will quote, Sheikh Yamani, who said this in 2000, right? You know, we always think, at some point oil will run out, but he said this famous quote, and you can read it all up there. We are not going to end, so the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone, right? And the same thing will be true for fossil fuels. There will be a point where there's so much fossil fuel and nobody will wants to anything to do with it, right? Because it's just, it's ridiculous. If you have free energy, why would you burn anything? So this brings us to the next disruption, right? We have a really strange way of creating motion and warmth and stuff like that. We have like little fire engines that, create energy, So we have like little engines in cars, we have little engines in our basement that create energy for us. And this is of course quite queer, it's like, having a mobile phone, I left it over here, with a little generator that I have to, put fuel in every once in a while, right? If you have free electric energy, why would you not move to a completely electric world where you have electric cars, where you have electric transportation generally, where you have electric airplanes, right? And by the way, if you think, and by the way, this is my wife here, and look at the faces of everybody. I love this photograph. She's such a great advocate for electric mobility. Everybody smiles when she does it. But if you think this can only be done in Silicon Valley, well, think again. Yesterday actually I visited a friend of mine, Christian von Höslin. He has a company called eTurn. And he's in the wonderful village of Schondorf am Ammersee, and he builds electric cars. So he has a car that is based on a chassis built out of carbon fiber epoxy, and he has built a battery system that is basically on the same price-performance ratio as the Tesla battery, and it's scalable from sports cars, small cars, to 40-ton trucks, if he wants to. So he's working on that. So he wants to basically be the Tesla of transportation, and we are all getting there. Another thing that is going to play a big role is artificial intelligence. We don't really know where this is going. It's a little bit hard to see, but this is actually a friend of mine's company, Eric Hansen. He has a company called Hansen Robotics in Hong Kong, and they produce human-like robots. And this is just one of the aspects of artificial intelligence. There's a lot of other things. Ben Goertzel, he, the guy who runs the Addis lab, he has a hedge fund that uses artificial intelligence to bet, and they, of course, outperform humans quite significantly. So these are kind of obvious artificial intelligence things, but it will go into areas where we think we humans are extremely good. Like, what about creativity? Maybe your next logo design will actually come from a computer and it will look better than the stuff that the humans come up with. And what about interpretations of things, and what about writing poems? I don't know, right? We'll see. So this will be a big deal. Another one which I'm heavily involved in is additive manufacturing. If you look around, everything you see is assembled from multiple parts. Well, with 3D printing and additive manufacturing, you basically can build stuff out of fairy dust, right? So instead of assembling things, you can just build it out of nothing, consuming very little material, and of course creating things that we have never conceived before, right? You can print electronics, you can print different materials. This sky is the limit. We have absolutely no clue where this is going. This is where I'm spending a lot of my time and my money. And this actually goes into space. So if you want to print a lunar base, here's your paper for you. This is a paper from an Italian team. They want to print basically a lunar base out of lunar soil using 3D printers. Which brings us to the next thing, space. We see a re-emergence of space technology, basically driven by the same guy who gave us the electric car again, Elon Musk. So this is from a couple of days ago, the new Dragon vehicle that will ship astronauts into space starting next year. It's mainly driven by lower cost. There's new materials comparing to the Apollo program 50 years ago, and there's some new interest in exploration. I mean, so people are thinking big again, right? For a long time we were quite satisfied, buying LPs, and then came the internet and stuff, and now we are looking into stuff like space again. And by the way, if you think this is only Elon Musk, here I'm sitting in a spacecraft, which back then, it was a year ago, sat in a garage in Mojave, in the Mojave Desert. It's a company called Xcore, and for the last decades they've been building a suborbital vehicle there, and they are now getting ready to fly next year. So it's a team of a couple of folks. It's not NASA, it's not the European Union, it's not a government. It's a bunch of really, really smart people driven by entrepreneurial spirit. Another one, and that's the final one. There's plenty more, but I just want to give you a couple of things where I think some of the key developments in the next couple of years are going to be. Underwater technology. I mean, the old saying, we have two-thirds of the planets are covered with water. We have no clue what's going on there. Most of it is undiscovered, especially if you want to go deep. The surface of the water is discovered, is researched by satellites all of the time. But if you want to go deeper, nothing there. Actually, very scary thought, because the ocean plays a big role in climate change, and we have no past data. We have no clue what the pH level, the acidity of the ocean was 20 years ago. So we can measure it now, but we don't have past data, which makes it hard to make a model. So lots of interesting stuff to work on, right? So do you have to be Elon Musk to do that, right? So it's actually an interesting question, right? This guy is probably one of the smartest people on the planet, and he has given us a lot of stuff that is quite transformative. So what makes an Elon Musk? And I would argue it's not that he's smarter than other people. I think there's a lot of smart people in the world. I think at some point he decided to be Elon Musk and not care what other people say. Right? When he started his space company, everybody said, yeah, that's a great way to spend the millions you made with PayPal. Right? We'll talk again in 5 years, and then if you have to raise money again and start a new startup because you ran out of money. Well, he almost came to that, but he didn't. He actually succeeded, and so there's SpaceX, right? So I think the key thing is, that we as entrepreneurs, we have this little voice in our head that tells us, oh no, you have no clue about this, or oh my God, nobody's tried that before, or this is such a bold idea. If I tell somebody, they will say I'm crazy, and we just have to kill this voice, right? Because the stuff, when people actually try to do it, and when they are smart enough to do it, and let's face it, we are all smart people here. We have the best education in the world. We're quite privileged. We are very rich compared to most people in the world. If we don't do this stuff, then who will do it actually, right? So let's talk about a couple of folks. I had the pleasure of visiting this guy here, I was a fan of him for a while. So I got to visit him. I actually almost met, where are you here? Hanno, because he was also in the British Virgin Island. So I mean, look at this guy. He's dyslexic. He dropped out of school. He started a student magazine. Then he sold records out of his basement for quite a while. And then he sold more records and more and more and more, and then finally sold Virgin Records for £500 million to EMI. And then he did something really crazy. He started an airline, right? And everybody was like, yeah, right. Richard, you have no clue about airlines. Why do you start an airline? And by the way, most airlines are almost bankrupt. So what chance in hell do you have to actually succeed? Well, it seems to have worked out, right? But I don't want to also only talk about Richard. A little bit hard to see. Catalina, she's a lawyer. One day she was so pissed that she was working in the law firm like crazy that she decided to backpack around the world for 18 months. And then decided to go into the lingerie business. So she's competing with Victoria's Secret now. But her lingerie is actually created by people in Colombia living in slums, by single mothers living in slums. And because she's a lawyer, right, she knows everything about manufacturing, she completely reinvented the supply chain for lingerie. So instead of using the regular materials that you usually buy, she recycles PET bottles. And instead of dyeing them, and dyeing is a really, really dirty process, right? You have literally, you have like green and red rivers going through some towns in the developing world. She actually uses thermosublimal printing to print the colors onto the fabric. So again, she's a lawyer. What does she know about manufacturing, etc.? It's just that one day she decided, I will learn about it, and there we go. I will also quickly talk about Blake here. My friend Blake created a social network for creatives and decided to publish a magazine, a paper magazine. Crazy, right? Everybody thinks he's crazy. I think it's an interesting idea. And he pointed to me to a video they did a couple of years ago, and I think this sums it up. So the question is, what will you do, and what do you feel entitled to do? And there was a really nice interview with Steve Jobs way before he learned how to dress and shave. Let me see if I can actually put it on here. Okay.
Inside the world, try not to bash into the walls too much, try to have a nice family life, have fun, save a little money. That's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you. And you can change it, you can influence it, you can build your own things that other people can use.
Just a sec.
The minute that you grow up, you tend to get told that the world is the way it is. Your life is just to live your life inside the world, try not to bash into the walls too much, try to have a nice family life, have fun, save a little money. That's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact. And that is, everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you. And you can change it, you can influence it, you can build your own things that other people can use. And the minute that you understand you can poke life and actually something will, you push in, something will pop out the other side, you can change it, you can mold it. That's maybe the most important thing, is to shake off this erroneous notion that life is there and you're just going to live it, versus embrace it, change it, improve it, make your mark upon it. Once you learn that, you'll never be the same again.
So that's the point, right? So everything around you was created by people no smarter than you, right? So why did they create it? So food for thought. That's it.